Elliot Hayes sat motionless in the dim glow of their bedroom, the quiet hum of the fan the only sound in the still night. His fingers trembled as he glanced down at Tessa's phone. She had fallen asleep beside him, her breathing slow and steady. But what he had just read on her screen felt like a jagged stone lodged in his chest. The words glared at him, burning into his mind. Last night was unforgettable. His heart froze. The message wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't an innocent exchange. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating the air in the room. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. Who was she talking to? His pulse quickened as his eyes flickered back to the message. The room seemed to close in around him. His mind spun, each thought sharper than the last. How could he not have seen it? The betrayal. Elliot's pulse hammered in his ears as his hands shook violently. A cold sweat coated his skin. His stomach twisted with a growing mix of disbelief and rage. He stared at the phone, almost willing the screen to change, to show him it was all a misunderstanding. But it never did. What was she hiding? The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Could this mean what I think it means? He couldn't shake the image of Tessa in another man's arms. The possibility gnawed at him relentlessly, filling his mind with 1,000 unanswered questions. Who is he? What happened? The uncertainty gnawed at him. Was it just a moment? Or something worse? He felt like he was suffocating. The room grew colder, the silence suffocating. How had things gotten here? He thought about the long hours at work, the days that bled together into routine. He had been distant. Was that enough to push her away? His breath shaky, Elliot turned to Tessa. His body felt heavy with dread. She has to wake up. Now. Tessa, he whispered, his voice shaking. Tessa, wake up. He nudged her shoulder, his voice edged with panic. She stirred, blinking her eyes open, disoriented from sleep. Elliot? Her voice was soft, almost too soft. He couldn't mask the tremor in his voice. What is this? He asked, thrusting the phone toward her, the incriminating text burning between them like a live wire. Tessa's eyes darted to the screen, and her face immediately softened. It's nothing, she said quickly, her voice too calm, too practiced. I was just messing around, it doesn't mean anything. Her words didn't match the tightness in her shoulders. The way she pulled the covers up to her chin suggested a sudden defensive posture, one that only deepened his suspicion. She was hiding something. He knew it. Elliot's hand shook as he dropped the phone on the bed between them. Just a kiss? That's all? He asked, his voice tightening with disbelief. Tessa, tell me the truth, you're not telling me everything. Her eyes flitted away, avoiding his gaze. She cleared her throat, but her words were cold, rehearsed. It was nothing. A mistake. It didn't mean anything. Elliot leaned in closer, his voice low and controlled, but full of tension. A mistake? Tessa, how do you expect me to believe that? Her face flushed, her fingers digging into the sheets beneath her. I swear, Elliot, it was a one-time thing. You have to trust me, she insisted, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, and every word she said felt like a dagger wrapped in lies. Her defensiveness, the way she seemed so calm, it all felt wrong. Why wasn't she panicking? Elliot's stomach twisted painfully as his mind reeled. Her excuses didn't fit. They were too easy, too simple. A kiss? He wanted to believe her, but his gut screamed at him that there was more. The phone was still on the bed. The words, "Last night was unforgettable," still hanging in the air. He couldn't ignore it. She had looked at the message, and there had been no shock on her face. No guilt, no regret, just cold detachment. Something was terribly wrong. Elliot pushed his hand through his hair, the anger inside him starting to simmer to a dangerous boil. Tessa, why won't you just be honest with me? His voice was raw, a whisper of desperation leaking through. I'm honest with you, she replied, her voice too steady, too detached. There's nothing more to say. But in his heart, Elliot knew. She was lying. He could feel it. His instincts had never been this sure before, and in this moment, the distance between them felt like an entire lifetime. The air in the room was thick with tension, every breath they took feeling heavier than the last. Elliot stared at Tessa, trying to find any trace of truth in her eyes, but all he saw was distance. A wall had gone up between them, one that couldn't be torn down by a mere apology. His chest tightened and he suddenly realized what was happening, what had been happening. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a betrayal. Elliot stood, unable to sit still any longer. I can't do this anymore, Tessa. His voice trembled, with both anger and heartbreak. How long have you been lying to me? Tessa's face fell, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of something, regret perhaps, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. She swallowed, a soft, defeated sound escaping her lips. I didn't mean for it to happen, Elliot, but you've been gone. You've been so distant. I just needed something. Someone. He stared at her, the realization cutting through him. She had let this happen, and worse, she had let it get this far. Their marriage, the foundation of everything they'd built together, was crumbling before his eyes. Tessa's voice trembled. I never meant to hurt you, but the damage was done. And no matter how much she tried to explain, Elliot knew the truth. This wasn't just a kiss. It was the beginning of the end. Elliot and Tessa had once been inseparable. The early years of their marriage were marked by passionate exchanges, long nights of laughter, and the kind of love that felt electric. But that was a decade ago. Now their relationship had slipped into a monotonous routine, one that was as predictable as the ticking of a clock. Their mornings were spent navigating the chaos of getting the kids ready for school, and the evenings blurred into one another as Elliot collapsed into bed, exhausted from the demands of his corporate job. Tessa, meanwhile, was left managing the house, silently fuming at the increasing distance between them. The affection had long been replaced by polite, perfunctory gestures. The once vibrant spark that ignited their bond had long since dimmed. It wasn't that they didn't care for each other, but that care had been buried under a mountain of responsibilities. They had become strangers living in the same house, moving through life on autopilot. Elliot had always been the type to dive head first into his work. As a corporate manager, his days were long, his responsibilities overwhelming. By the time he returned home, his body was drained, his mind too clouded to give anything more. He loved Tessa, but he couldn't escape the demands of his job. Late nights at the office, early morning meetings, and constant emails drained him to the point of numbness. And yet, there was always more to do. So much more. When he did come home, he had little energy to invest in his marriage. The laughter and conversation they used to share felt like an exhausting chore. Tessa had tried to fill the emotional gaps, but Elliot was too consumed to notice. In his mind, the job was just a phase, something temporary that would pass. But deep down, a quiet voice was warning him that the cracks in his marriage were widening. He just couldn't hear it over the noise of his ambition. Tessa's days were long, quiet, and isolating. As a freelance graphic designer, she spent most of her time working from home, where the only voices she heard were the ones coming from her clients' emails and conference calls. In the silence of her home, she could almost hear the echo of her own loneliness. As Elliot's hours stretched into oblivion, Tessa's world grew smaller. She missed him, yes, but more than that, she missed the person he used to be. The man who would kiss her good morning and ask about her day. Now all she had were the empty spaces between them. Each time she tried to reach out, he was too tired, too distracted. She wanted to scream, "Do you even see me anymore?" But she never did. Instead, she buried herself in her work, hoping that one day the distance would shrink. But with every passing day, it seemed like the emotional void between them only deepened. She felt invisible, her worth slipping through the cracks. Then came Grayson Mills. He was a colleague from one of Tessa's design projects, a man whose presence felt like a breath of fresh air. Grayson was charming, effortlessly so, and his humor made Tessa feel lighter, like the weight of the world hadn't been pressing down on her for years. His attention was sharp, but it wasn't the kind that felt forced. It was warm and genuine, like he was actually interested in her as a person, not just a colleague. The conversations with Grayson flowed easily. They shared ideas about work, but somehow those conversations always ended up drifting into more personal territory. Dreams, frustrations, fears. Tessa hadn't realized how starved she was for this kind of connection until Grayson came along. She found herself looking forward to their chats, feeling a spark that had long been missing from her marriage. Every time they spoke, something inside her awakened. Why couldn't Elliot talk to me like this? Grayson made her feel seen, heard in a way that Elliot hadn't for so long. She started to crave it, crave him, in a way she hadn't expected. At first, Tessa tried to convince herself that her growing attachment to Grayson was harmless. He was just a friend, right? A professional connection. But as the weeks passed, she couldn't ignore the tension between them. It was subtle, like the soft undercurrent of a storm. The way their eyes met a little too long, the way their laughs lingered in the air. She could feel it, that undeniable chemistry, crackling just beneath the surface. It wasn't the sort of flirtation that screamed for attention, but it was there. The way Grayson would smile at her as if no one else existed in that moment. The way he'd casually touch her arm, a gesture that once would have sent her heart racing. She couldn't deny the pull. It was magnetic, like they were dancing around, something neither of them was willing to name. "Grayson, you don't have to be so nice to me," she laughed nervously one afternoon, unsure if she was even making sense. But Grayson just smiled, his eyes warm. "I like being nice to you, Tessa," he said, and the way he said it made her pulse quicken. It wasn't just friendly, it was different. As Grayson continued to shower her with attention, Tessa found herself drawing further away from Elliot almost unconsciously. Every time she shared a laugh with Grayson, a quiet part of her couldn't help but compare the ease of their conversations to the emotional walls that had built up between her and Elliot. Grayson didn't judge her for feeling empty. He listened. He understood. When Tessa spoke of her frustrations, her dreams that had been put on hold, Grayson was there, hanging on to every word. By now, she'd begun to rely on him, more than she realized. When the weight of the days, loneliness became too much to bear, it was Grayson's words that echoed in her mind, not Elliot's. She tried to push it down. She told herself that it was just a phase, that it was nothing compared to the years she'd spent with Elliot. But the emotional gaps between them only widened, and Grayson, unknowingly or not, had filled those gaps with understanding and affection. Every smile, every lingering look, every gesture of kindness made her question everything she thought she knew about her marriage. Was this the connection she had been longing for all along? Or was it just a dangerous distraction from a deeper pain she was too afraid to confront? Elliot sat at the kitchen table, the cold coffee in front of him untouched. His mind raced. Tessa's explanation of the text message seemed plausible at first, just a work-related query, she said. But something in the way she brushed it off didn't sit right with him. The defensiveness in her voice, the quick way she changed the subject, felt like a red flag. Was he overthinking it? He tried to silence the nagging voice in his head, but the seed of doubt had been planted. His eyes lingered on her every movement, studying the way she interacted with him. Her gaze avoided his too often, and the warmth that once existed between them felt cold and distant. The silence between them stretched on for hours, suffocating. Every conversation felt like a lie. Every glance like a secret. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The feeling that Tessa was hiding something that didn't add up. His mind spiraled further into obsession. The idea of betrayal gnawed at him, consuming every thought. Could she be cheating on him? He wasn't sure anymore, but he was going to find out. It started small, casually checking Tessa's phone when she left it unattended. At first there was nothing, just messages from work, group chats about the kids. But as the days went on, Elliot's eyes became sharper, more focused. His thumb would hover over her locked screen, trembling as he considered his next move. He found himself opening her phone more often, searching for anything that might explain the tension in their marriage. Every time the phone buzzed, his heart raced. Who was it? Then one evening a message flashed across her screen as she stepped away from the kitchen. He hesitated for a moment, then quickly unlocked it. The message was simple, but the sender's name caught his eye. Grayson Mills. His stomach churned. Grayson. The name was familiar. Tessa had mentioned him before. A co-worker, she'd said. He remembered how she'd spoken about him. There was an ease, a fondness in her voice that he hadn't heard in years. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he could feel the weight of the unknown pressing on him. The more he dug, the more questions piled up. Tessa's behavior had changed subtly. Vague answers when he asked about her day, a new reluctance to engage emotionally. She was more distant than ever. The cracks were deepening and he couldn't ignore them. Every text, every social media post became another clue he couldn't ignore. Was she hiding something from him? Tessa could feel the shift in their dynamic. She could sense Elliot's growing suspicion, the silent questions hanging between them. Every glance, every pause in their conversation felt like an interrogation. And she hated it. Elliot, I told you, it's just work, she repeated for the third time, her voice tight. You're overthinking this. But it didn't matter. How many times she reassured him. The walls between them were already up. His eyes, once filled with love, now seemed cold, accusatory. I'm not overthinking anything, Elliot shot back, frustration bleeding into his voice. I'm asking, because you're pulling away from me. Something's wrong, Tessa, I can feel it. Tessa's chest tightened. She knew the truth. She felt it every day. But how could she explain? How could she confess what had been happening, knowing how much it would destroy him? The guilt twisted in her stomach, but she couldn't bear the thought of telling him the truth. You're imagining things, she said, her tone sharper than she intended. But as she said it, she realized the wall she'd been building to protect herself had only made things worse. Every time she pushed back, every time she denied, she only pushed him further away. She could feel the emotional chasm widening. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a pressure cooker. Every word between them was loaded, every silence heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. The children sensed it too, quiet, withdrawn, their laughter muted by the tension that lingered in every corner. Elliot couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, The images of Tessa and Grayson lingered. What was going on? Tessa, too, lay awake at night, haunted by the lies she was living. She couldn't tell him what had been happening, couldn't bring herself to face the truth, but each time she looked at Elliot, she saw the cracks in their marriage. The love they once shared had been replaced by something unrecognizable, something broken, something distant. The tension in the house was suffocating, and there were no easy words left. Every interaction between them now felt like a confrontation, an awkward exchange laced with mistrust. Tessa tried to bury the guilt she felt, but it wouldn't go away. It sat like a stone in her chest, pressing down on her, suffocating her. One night after Tessa had gone to bed, Elliot found himself once again sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on her phone. His hands were shaking, his pulse racing. He knew he shouldn't do this, but the temptation was too strong. He unlocked it, and there it was. Another message from Grayson. This time, it was different. A photo of Tessa smiling, her arms wrapped around Grayson. It wasn't anything explicit, but it was intimate. The kind of closeness that made Elliot's stomach churn. The blood drained from his face as he scrolled through more messages. They were more personal now. Conversations that had nothing to do with work. Words like, "I miss you," "You're the best part of my day," and "I can't stop thinking about you." Elliot's heart pounded in his chest. The walls around him began to collapse. How long had this been going on? His hands trembled as he closed the phone. The truth was out. But now, Elliot didn't know what to do with it. Confront her? Destroy their family? Or pretend it wasn't real? He was trapped in his own nightmare, torn between the man he had once been and the reality that he could no longer escape. Tessa sat in front of her computer, staring blankly at her design project. Her mind wasn't on the work, though. It was on Grayson, his texts, his touch. The way he made her feel, seen, valued, important. She had tried to resist, tried to push him away. But every time she told herself to stop, his words would invade her thoughts. "You deserve to feel loved, Tessa." The guilt was suffocating, and yet Grayson made her feel alive again. He had awakened something in her that she hadn't felt in years, the sense of being wanted, of being understood. And no matter how much she told herself that it was wrong, that she was betraying her family, the allure of his attention was irresistible. She loved Elliot. She still did. But the emotional void in their marriage was too deep. She couldn't fill it with his apologies or reassurances anymore. And Grayson had become the escape she so desperately needed. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Grayson. "I'm thinking of you." Tessa's heart pounded. She knew it was wrong, but for just a moment, she allowed herself to smile. As Elliot's investigation deepened, the psychological toll on both of them was undeniable. Elliot's paranoia had become all-consuming. His eyes were always on Tessa, watching for any hint of a lie, any trace of deception. His obsession with the truth had taken over his every waking moment. Tessa, on the other hand, was unraveling. The emotional cost of her affair, the guilt and the constant deception weighed heavily on her. But every time she looked at Grayson, the tension eased. The psychological pressure of living two lives was tearing her apart. And yet, she couldn't seem to stop. Elliot's obsession with uncovering the truth alienated him further from his family. His focus on Grayson, on the proof of betrayal, pushed away the one thing he still wanted: answers. Tessa's secret life, meanwhile, pulled her further from the marriage. The deeper they both sank into their own worlds of lies and guilt, the further they drifted apart. The truth was a beast, clawing at their minds, and neither of them could escape the damage they had already caused. Elliot sat at his desk, his fingers trembling as he stared at the screen of his laptop. The anonymous email had come just moments ago, the subject line simple and to the point. For your eyes only. A knot twisted in his stomach as he clicked it open, the anticipation clawing at him. The first image was grainy, too blurry to make out anything significant, but the next one? His breath caught in his throat. There was Tessa, unmistakably, smiling, her arm draped over the shoulders of a man he instantly recognized. Grayson. His heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing to his ears. The next picture was taken at a different angle, clearly in a hotel room. Tessa's eyes were closed, lips parted in a kiss. Grayson's hand rested possessively on her waist. Elliot's world spun out of control, the photos flashing in his mind over and over. How long had this been happening? His pulse hammered in his throat, the room closing in around him. He couldn't process it. He didn't want to process it, but the evidence was irrefutable. The truth he'd feared for weeks was right in front of him. The photos sat heavy in his hand, the weight of betrayal more suffocating than anything Elliot had ever known. His mind was reeling, anger, disbelief, sorrow, all fighting for dominance. How could she do this to him? How could she betray everything they'd built together? His heart raced as he stood up, pacing the room. His mind was a hurricane of emotion, but there was only one thing he knew for sure. He had to confront her. The house felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing against his chest. His fingers clenched the photos until they were almost ripped in half. He couldn't keep quiet anymore. He couldn't let this go. The truth had to come out, even if it destroyed everything. Where was she? His eyes darted toward the hallway, his pulse quickening, knowing the confrontation was imminent. Tessa entered the kitchen just as Elliot stepped into her path, his face a storm of fury and heartbreak. Without a word, he thrust the photos in front of her, his voice trembling with raw emotion. "Tessa," he choked, his voice breaking as he spoke. "What is this?" Her face drained of color as she looked at the images, her eyes widening in shock. She stepped back, her breath shallow, her gaze darting to the floor. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence between them was deafening, heavy with the weight of the truth. Elliot's voice cracked with pain. "How long, Tessa? How long have you been lying to me? To us?" Tessa swallowed hard, the guilt and regret flooding her face, but she still tried to defend herself. "Elliot, it's not what you think." "Not what I think." Elliot spat, his anger rising. "You're in a hotel room with him, Tessa. That's not what I think." His hands shook with rage, the photographs shaking between them like the fragile thread of their marriage. I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her voice faltering. Her eyes pleaded with him, but the damage was already done. Her words rang hollow. There was no going back now. The silence that followed was agonizing. And then, with a shaky breath, Tessa finally whispered the words that had been hanging in the air for so long. "Yes," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes, I've been seeing him. I'm sorry, Elliot, I never meant for this to happen." Tessa collapsed onto the chair, her body trembling as the weight of her own words crashed down on her. The tears flowed freely now, her sobs ragged, desperate. "Never meant for you to find out this way," she cried, her voice full of guilt. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I—" She paused, struggling for words. "I was so lonely, Elliot. So alone. You stopped seeing me. I stopped feeling anything. I tried to reach out to you to make you notice me, but it felt like you didn't care anymore." Her hands wrung together in her lap, her face crumpled with regret. "Grayson, he listened to me. He saw me. And I don't know how it happened. It just did. Elliot stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His heart was breaking, and yet hearing her words made the pain somehow worse. The truth was too much to bear. She had been right there in front of him, but had she ever really been with him? She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry, Elliot. I don't know how to make this right. I never wanted to hurt you. But I'm so lost in all of this." Elliot's chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to lash out. But he couldn't find the words. He was drowning in this ocean of lies. The conversation quickly escalated, the emotional tidal wave, too much for either of them to control. Elliot's hurt was palpable, his voice low and filled with disbelief. "How long, Tessa?" He forced the words out, each one like a blade cutting deeper. "How long have you been lying to me? Pretending like nothing was wrong while you were with him?" His voice broke, shaking with emotion. "Do you even know what you've done?" Tessa flinched at the venom in his words. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing could undo the damage. Nothing could bring them back from this. "Elliot, please, I want you to leave." Elliot interrupted, his voice steady now, the hurt and betrayal clear in his eyes. "I can't do this anymore. I can't be with someone who would betray me like this." Tessa's face crumpled. She could see it in his eyes, the anger, the disbelief, the broken trust. She reached out for him, but he recoiled, taking a step back. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," Elliot said, his voice a whisper, yet it felt like a death sentence. From upstairs, the sound of shouting echoed through the house, reverberating in the walls like an earthquake. The children stirred in their beds, groggy and confused, hearing their parents' voices raised in anger and distress. Elliot's heart shattered as he heard his son's small voice call out from the stairs. "Mom? Dad? What's going on?" Tessa looked toward the stairs, her face drained of color. She hadn't wanted them to know, not like this. But the truth couldn't be hidden anymore. Elliot felt the weight of his decision crashing down on him. This wasn't just about him and Tessa. This was about the children, the family they had built together. "Everything's fine," he said, his voice cracking as he looked toward the stairs, but the lie felt hollow in his mouth. No, nothing was fine. Not anymore. As the night wore on, the house fell into a deafening silence, the storm of emotions lingering in the air. Elliot stood in the kitchen, his back against the counter, staring at the floor. His mind was a battlefield. The anger inside him was still burning, fury that had only grown stronger with every passing minute. Grayson, Tessa. They had both betrayed him in ways he couldn't even begin to process. He wanted to make them feel the same pain, the same crushing weight of betrayal. He wanted revenge. But then, there were the children, their innocent faces, the life they had built together. Could he really destroy it all? Could he walk away from the family he had loved, the family he had fought for? The conflict inside him was suffocating. Part of him wanted to leave, to walk out and never look back. But the other part, the part that still loved Tessa, the part that cared for his children, begged him to stay, to try to rebuild, even if it meant tearing everything apart in the process. As the night stretched on, Elliot was left with nothing but silence and uncertainty. What was he supposed to do now? The weight of the confrontation hung heavy in the air, and as the echoes of their last words faded, Elliot knew he couldn't stay. Not in this house, not with the ghosts of the betrayal lingering in every room. The photos, the accusations, the tears, everything had shattered in an instant. With a final broken glance at Tessa, he grabbed a duffel bag and headed for the door, each step feeling like a betrayal to the life he once knew. The house, once a place of warmth and shared memories, now felt like a prison. Elliot's temporary apartment was cold and unfamiliar, but it was the only space where he could breathe without the constant reminder of what had just happened. The walls felt too close, and every corner seemed to echo the questions he couldn't answer. His mind was a maze of confusion, grief, and anger, and no matter how many times he ran through the details, he couldn't make sense of any of it. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts consumed by the woman he loved, the woman who had torn his world apart. The space between them was growing, and Elliot didn't know if it could ever be bridged again. Therapy was supposed to help, he told himself. It was supposed to be the first step toward healing. But as Elliot sat in the sterile room, the counselor's gentle voice felt distant, like an echo in the void. "How are you feeling, Elliot?" the therapist asked, her pen poised over the notepad. Elliot shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wanted to say angry. He wanted to scream betrayed, but instead, he just swallowed the words and let the silence stretch between them. "It's hard to describe," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how I feel anymore. I loved her. I still do, but I don't know how to live with what she did." He let the words hang in the air, the weight of them suffocating. He couldn't stop thinking about the affair, the thought of Tessa, his wife, in another man's arms. His mind raced, each session leaving him more fragmented. The anger and the sadness were constant companions, and every time he tried to move forward, they pulled him back. He was desperate to understand how it all had unraveled so quickly, but the answers weren't coming. And the more he searched, the deeper the questions went. Tessa, too, was trying to piece her life back together, though she wasn't sure where to begin. The affair had been exposed, her lies laid bare, and she couldn't escape the shame that followed her like a dark cloud. Sitting in the therapist's office, Tessa felt like a stranger to herself. The woman who had once been so confident, so sure of her place in the world, now felt broken. Her hands trembled in her lap as she struggled to put her feelings into words. "I don't know who I am anymore," she confessed, her voice cracking. "I betrayed Elliot. I betrayed myself. I was lost. But I never meant to hurt him." Her therapist nodded, her expression gentle. "What led you to this point, Tessa?" Tessa closed her eyes, the memories flooding back. Grayson had made her feel seen, something she hadn't felt in years. Elliot had been there, physically, but emotionally, she had been alone for far too long. And Grayson, with his sweet words and comforting presence, had filled the void she didn't even know was there. But now, in the quiet aftermath, she realized that she had been manipulated. She had let her loneliness cloud her judgment, and the guilt gnawed at her insides. Grayson was a fleeting escape, a temporary fix for a much deeper emptiness. And now, as she sat in the quiet room, she realized that the damage was done. Elliot would never look at her the same way again. The fallout from the affair spread quickly. Word had gotten out, and Elliot's family and friends were left to pick sides. Some rallied behind him, their voices filled with righteous indignation. They had seen the man he was, a devoted husband and father betrayed by the woman he loved. He deserved better, they said. She doesn't deserve him, they whispered. But on Tessa's side, there were those who understood the pain she had endured in her marriage. Elliot wasn't there for her, they reasoned. He didn't see her the way she needed to be seen. They sympathized with her loneliness, her feelings of neglect. Elliot's heart broke a little more each time someone took Tessa's side. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about the reality that his life was no longer just his own. Their life was now a spectacle, something to be judged by others. The reactions from their community only made things harder. Tessa felt the weight of their sympathy like a lead weight. Her friends looked at her with pity, their soft voices murmuring words of comfort, but she could see the judgment in their eyes. How could she do this to him? Elliot, on the other hand, found no solace in the support he received. Their concern only reminded him of the immense loss he had suffered. The whispers followed him everywhere, whether he was at the grocery store or meeting with friends at the pub. He could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to make the next move. Tessa and Elliot both wrestled with the pressure. Their actions, each small personal choice, were now under a microscope. Everyone had an opinion on what they should do, and neither of them knew how to escape it. In the midst of the chaos, both of them felt more alone than ever. Both Elliot and Tessa sought legal counsel, though neither was ready to make a decision. The question of divorce loomed large, but neither wanted to admit that the end might be inevitable. They had both invested so much in this relationship, in the family they had built, that the thought of tearing it apart felt unbearable. Elliot sat in a lawyer's office, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "What does this mean for the kids?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What happens to them if we get a divorce?" The lawyer, a middle-aged man with graying hair, offered a sympathetic glance. "The custody arrangements will depend on many factors, Elliot. But remember, this isn't just about you and Tessa. It's about what's best for your children." Tessa, too, sat in a lawyer's office, the documents in front of her a stark reminder of how far things had gone. Her thoughts swirled around. The potential consequences, financial struggles, custody battles, and above all, the looming question of whether she would ever regain Elliot's trust. She wasn't ready to give up on them, but she wasn't sure if there was anything left to save. Despite the emotional turmoil, both Elliot and Tessa shared a common focus: their children. Neither of them wanted their kids to suffer the fallout of their mistakes. They knew that whatever happened, the impact on their children had to be minimized. As Elliot sat on the couch, his children's laughter from the other room felt like a distant memory. He wanted to shield them from the truth, but they were smart. They could sense the tension in the air. The constant bickering, the long silences, it was taking its toll on them. Tessa, too, found herself consumed by thoughts of their children. The guilt of what she had done, the pain she had caused, was now compounded by the worry of how they would cope with the fallout. In the midst of the chaos, the children's well-being was the only thing that seemed to matter. Their lives, their futures, depended on the choices that Elliot and Tessa made now. Elliot sat alone in his apartment, the weight of the world pressing on his chest. Could he ever heal from this? Could he ever look at Tessa the same way again? The love he had once felt seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the bitterness of betrayal. Tessa, too, sat in silence, the weight of her own mistakes heavy on her shoulders. Could she fix this? Could she ever make Elliot understand how sorry she was? And could she find a way to forgive herself? The road ahead was uncertain. Neither of them had the answers, and the emotional weight of the decisions they faced was overwhelming. They had come so far together, but now it felt like everything was falling apart. As the days stretched into weeks, the question remained: could they heal, or was this the end of everything they had known? Elliot sat in the darkness of his temporary apartment, staring at the empty space in front of him. The silence pressed against his chest, suffocating him. His thoughts had been a whirlwind ever since he left Tessa, but now, in the quiet, they had settled into something undeniable. He had spent so much time hating her for what she had done, for shattering the life they built, but in the stillness of his grief, a different realization began to surface. Maybe I wasn't the husband she needed. The truth hit him harder than anything he had imagined. Elliot's mind retraced the years. how he had been physically present, but emotionally absent. His work consumed him, his focus turned inward, and Tessa had slowly faded into the background. She had been there, just like he had been, but not really there. Not in the way they once were. He felt the shame creep in, dark and cold. The years of emotional neglect that had become the silent killer of their connection. It wasn't just her fault, it was ours. Tessa sat alone in her bedroom, the walls closing in on her as the weight of what she had done crashed down. The affair had been her escape, but now it felt like a prison. How could I have done this? Her thoughts circled back to Grayson. He had made her feel seen when Elliot had stopped noticing her, when he stopped really being with her. But in the quiet aftermath of her decision, she saw things differently. The affair wasn't just about wanting someone else. It was about her unmet needs. It was about everything she had bottled up for too long. The whispers of loneliness, of needing affection, of needing someone to make her feel alive again. But those were just excuses, weren't they? Grayson had been an answer to a question she should have asked her husband. Instead, she had chosen the easy path, the secret one. And now, her marriage was shattered, her soul torn between the man she had betrayed and the one who had been nothing more than a fleeting distraction. She had destroyed them both, and no apology could ever undo the damage. In the aftermath, the one thing that both of them knew for sure was this. Trust was fragile. A single misstep, a single lie, and everything could crumble. Elliot replayed that night over and over again. The night he had caught Tessa, the night everything broke. How could I have trusted her? It wasn't just the affair that shattered him. It was the revelation that, for so long, there had been cracks in their foundation that he hadn't seen, that he had ignored. In the midst of the chaos, the children's well-being was the only thing that seemed to matter. Their lives, their futures, depended on the choices that Elliot and Tessa made now. Elliot sat alone in his apartment, the weight of the world pressing on his chest. Could he ever heal from this? Could he ever look at Tessa the same way again? The love he had once felt seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the bitterness of betrayal. Tessa, too, sat in silence, the weight of her own mistakes heavy on her shoulders. Could she fix this? Could she ever make Elliot understand how sorry she was? And could she find a way to forgive herself? The road ahead was uncertain. Neither of them had the answers, and the emotional weight of the decisions they faced was overwhelming. They had come so far together, but now it felt like everything was falling apart. As the days stretched into weeks, the question remained, could they heal, or was this the end of everything they had known? Elliot sat in the darkness of his temporary apartment, staring at the empty space in front of him. The silence pressed against his chest, suffocating him. His thoughts had been a whirlwind ever since he left Tessa, but now, in the quiet, they had settled into something undeniable. He had spent so much time hating her for what she had done, for shattering the life they built, but in the stillness of his grief, a different realization began to surface. Maybe I wasn't the husband she needed. The truth hit him harder than anything he had imagined. Elliot's mind retraced the years, how he had been physically present, but emotionally absent. His work consumed him, his focus turned inward, and Tessa had slowly faded into the background. She had been there, just like he had been, but not really there, not in the way they once were. He felt the shame creep in, dark and cold, the years of emotional neglect that had become the silent killer of their connection. It wasn't just her fault, it was ours. Tessa sat alone in her bedroom, the walls closing in on her as the weight of what she had done crashed down. The affair had been her escape, but now it felt like a prison. How could I have done this? Her thoughts circled back to Grayson. He had made her feel seen when Elliot had stopped noticing her, when he stopped really being with her. But in the quiet aftermath of her decision, she saw things differently. The affair wasn't just about wanting someone else. It was about her unmet needs. It was about everything she had bottled up for too long. The whispers of loneliness, of needing affection, of needing someone to make her feel alive again. But those were just excuses, weren't they? Grayson had been an answer to a question she should have asked her husband. Instead, she had chosen the easy path, the secret one. And now, her marriage was shattered, her soul torn between the man she had betrayed and the one who had been nothing more than a fleeting distraction. She had destroyed them both, and no apology could ever undo the damage. In the aftermath, the one thing that both of them knew for sure was this: trust was fragile. A single misstep, a single lie, and everything could crumble. Elliot replayed that night over and over again. The night he had caught Tessa, the night everything broke. How could I have trusted her? It wasn't just the affair that shattered him. It was the revelation that, for so long, there had been cracks in their foundation that he hadn't seen, that he had ignored. Tessa, too, knew that the trust they had once built was gone. With it went the foundation of everything she thought was real. She could never look at Elliot the same way again, not after what she had done. The emotional toll was now undeniable. Elliot's trust issues were more than just doubts. They were like jagged pieces embedded deep in his heart. Each day without Tessa felt like a battle, and every conversation with her was a struggle against the weight of betrayal. He didn't know if he could ever trust anyone again, least of all her. Tessa wasn't free from the consequences either. Guilt twisted her insides, a constant companion that never left. She had betrayed the one person who had stood by her, the person who had loved her unconditionally. The whispers of self-loathing filled the quiet spaces of her mind. I don't even know who I am anymore. Their scars weren't visible, but they were just as deep, carved into their hearts, into their souls, into everything they had once believed to be unbreakable. As the days wore on, both Elliot and Tessa were forced to confront the brutal truth. They had never truly been emotionally connected, not in the way that truly mattered. They had shared a life, but they hadn't shared their vulnerabilities. They had lived alongside each other, but never inside each other's hearts. How did we let it get like this? Tessa asked herself, her mind unable to accept the reality of how far they had fallen. The physical affection had faded, and the emotional intimacy had been lost long before the affair began. Elliot, too, could see it now. The moments he had missed, the chances he had neglected. When Tessa had needed him most, he had been absent, thinking he could fix everything with just his presence, his work, his own emotional armor. But none of that mattered if they couldn't connect, if they couldn't communicate their fears, their hopes, their desires. The affair had been a consequence, a tragic, undeniable consequence of everything they had failed to nurture. In the quiet moments of reflection, Elliot and Tessa both realized that the affair wasn't the root of their problems. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a symptom of a much deeper breakdown. Elliot, sitting alone in his apartment, thought about the life they had once shared. All those years together, all the promises made. And yet, when it came down to it, they had never truly been there for each other in the ways that counted. They had failed to talk, failed to listen, and now they were paying the price. Tessa, too, understood the magnitude of her choices. I didn't just cheat on him, I failed us both. The finality of their Situation weighed heavily on both of them. There was no easy way out of this. No magic words that would heal the wounds. There was only the painful truth of what had happened, and the uncertain future that awaited them. Tessa's voice echoed in her head. In the end, it wasn't just a kiss. It was everything we never said. The weight of that realization hung over them like a storm, its full impact yet to be felt. But the road ahead was clear. Healing, if possible, would take more than just time. It would take something neither of them was sure they had left to give.